On this episode of the program, the hidden behind-the-scenes stories of what happens when you're running for Congress and you lose the faith of the leadership and the money that comes along with it. Plus, my reaction to the Mark Robinson situation. It is all coming up.
The following is brought to you by AB Puppy, Just Another Pilot, and Daily Tech News Show.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Politics program for September 20th, 2024. Your old pal Justin Robert Young joining you from Austin, Texas. And let's go ahead and welcome in one of our great friends of the program, former Congressman Scott Klug. Welcome back, our friend, former Congressman turned podcaster Scott Klug of Wisconsin. How you doing, buddy?
Good to see you again. Sorry that I dressed the same, but that's just because I'm fond of you as a friend now. Let me know what you're going to wear tomorrow.
Good. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're in uniform here, but that means that we're both going to be ready for our shifts at the Olive Garden in a few minutes. So Scott, something that I don't see talked about a lot. It is just blithely sort of mentioned in election circles of people who have never been involved in politics that like to talk about it online, like me. But it isn't really reported on because I would imagine that in a access dependent media environment, it is sensitive to talk about. And that is the allocation of money from party groups for Senate and Congress as we get into the home stretch. Summer is over. Labor Day is here. There are big decisions that need to be made from a leadership perspective on where you spend money and where you don't. Let's just go from the very top. For somebody that doesn't understand this at all, how would you explain the job of those congressional and senatorial leadership committees?
Sure. So as a candidate, you always have a responsibility to raise your own money. And that tends to be, $20 checks, fundraisers where people write checks for $100. In my case, we did everything in the world in Madison, Wisconsin, from pheasant shooting with guys who were outdoors, dinners with members of the Bankers Association, stuff on college campuses at UW where people gave you $5. But at the end of the day, as you move further on, the bigger money comes from political action committees. Those tend to be affiliated either around unions or they're affiliated around businesses. And you can't use corporate dollars. People have to write an individual check. So for example, if you're a Teamster, if you're a school teacher, you donate so much money to the NEA or you donate so much money to the Teamsters. If you belong to the Bankers Association, you do the same thing with the Bankers Association, the broadcasters. Is there a podcaster pack? Maybe we should set that up and get.
I don't think there's enough money in our business just yet, unless we're only talking about the Kelsey brothers and Joe Rogan. But I don't know. I'll put a memo at the next meeting.
All right. So A, you get money from individuals. B, you get it from PACs. But what people don't appreciate is there's lots of money from the National Republican Congressional Committee or its Democratic counterpart, or the National Republican Senatorial Committee or its counterpart. So first priority for all those groups are going to be protect your incumbents, right? So if you're looking over the map, you're going to say, well, it doesn't do us any good if Scott wins here, but Justin wins there. So the first tier of support is going to go there. Then they've got sort of tier one campaigns. So in the case of the Republicans this year, it would be West Virginia. So with Manchin leaving, they're going to target West Virginia and pour the cash in. Then you'll get races that are sort of on the bubble. So Sherrod Brown, for example, in Ohio, who's an incumbent Democrat, the Democrats are going to go all in there. The Republicans are going to go all in there because it's such a Republican state now in the presidential level. Then you get down to sort of the third tier guys who just about this time are getting the ugly phone calls that say, nah, thanks. It was a hell of a good run. And the best of luck to you. Maybe you can pull it off otherwise, but we're going to reallocate resources. And so you'll start to see really marginal candidates go by the wayside, and the big fights will focus in for both sides. Sometimes people lose their minds and assume they're going to be races to win, and they'll still keep betting on them. Now's where we put up Beto O'Rourke's photo behind me, because the Democrats were all in on the Texas races. That it's Texas, people. It's the same way Republicans always go, oh, there's a lot of corruption in New Jersey, and we'll win a big race in New Jersey this year. It's not going to happen. Yeah. So sometimes people just get emotionally involved, and then it comes down to the hardcore. And I've seen this sort of on all ways. So when I ran for 4 terms, quit on term limits, there was a big fight in the Republican Party, amazingly, in Madison, Wisconsin, to see who would be my successor. And a woman who was the state insurance commissioner under Tommy Thompson won, running against Tammy Baldwin in her first fight for Congress. She beat 2 other Democrats and got through. And early in September, I got a call from the Republican Congressional Committee to say, she is running a miserable race. And I actually, in fact, I got a call from Tom Cole, now an Oklahoma congressman, who was then the chair of the NRCC, the executive director. And I did most of my own stuff for folks who don't follow me always on Justin's show. Before I was in Congress, I spent 14 years in TV. So I did my own TV commercials with a buddy of mine who actually has written, movies in Hollywood and won, irises and all this stuff, and said, would you and John take over all the media race? And so that's what we did. And then she got traction. So then the money kept flowing in. We just had the same thing happen in Wisconsin this week. Tammy Baldwin's the incumbent now a U.S. senator.
In the Senate, yep.
Yeah, for 2 terms, going for a third. A very wealthy Wisconsin, Madison business guy is running for the Senate. His dad worked in the Reagan administration. He and his brother have run a lot of hedge funds and stuff all around the country and made a lot of money. He has run an absolutely miserable, in capital letters, Senate race to this point.
Okay.
Once when John and I, my buddy and I, were doing TV commercials, we tried to help somebody who was running for attorney general. And we went to a meeting, and we had sent him some scripts, and his wife sits down with us and has a cup of coffee in hand, and then proceeds to say, well, here are some scripts I wrote. And it's like, yeah. And she said, I was a radio television major in college.
Oh, no!
Like, yeah. So it's like, oh, Lord. So that's a lot of what Hovde's campaign looked like. It was really bad. Now,
homespun, because the only thing that I've known about Hovde in terms of just watching this from a national level and seeing him in interviews is that he's a charismatic guy. He's a charming guy. He does well in an interview, but you're saying that has not been captured in any way on the air in his...
They have been on the defensive since day one. They attacked him from being California. He's got a house in California. They have a bank in California, but he's really based here in Madison. They attacked him for a lot of the stuff he said, and he lost to Tommy Thompson in a primary to run against Tammy the first time around. And they've pulled a lot of old quotes off that out of context look miserable. Like he was talking about how tough it is to be a farmer, but now saying it's better because there's equipment. It makes your days better than they used to be, but it's still a hard life. But now when it comes in is they've got a quote that he says, well, farmers have it so much easier than they used to have. And they did interviews with farmers who said, what the hell are you talking about? Who is this guy? Yeah. But I saw this coming about 3 weeks ago because I saw a commercial that was the first commercial that's put Tammy back on her heels, where now she's had to respond to them. And there was this big story in the Milwaukee Journal today that says Hovde's campaign team and media team replaced, which means the National Republican Committee came in and said, we're not going to give you another dime unless you bring new people in. So for him, that's good news because now it's sort of the 7 closing weeks when people are just paying attention. So that sort of stuff happens all the time. And, the Biden decision to step aside, it's a tough business. I'm sure he didn't want to leave, and I'm sure Joe Biden said, we're going to hang on. We won all those races in Delaware, and we did this, and we got to the White House. And I'm sure, at some level, the Democrats just said, the money's not there, we're not going to throw a lot of it at you. And it's a tough business. And whether it was done, it's like The Godfather. Do you take him out in the barbershop, or do you, shoot him in the sauna? It's the way it goes. And so all around the country now, you will see both the Democratic House campaigns and the Senate campaigns running away from candidates and reallocating resources in places like Ohio or Wisconsin if you're a Republican, or the Democrats are probably putting more money into Nevada and Arizona if you're a Democrat trying to bet on battleground races. And everybody's throwing every Brinks trucks they can drive to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to win Pennsylvania. That's what it's all
And
gonna
boy, is there a lot of money sloshing around. I've joked about, to your Biden point, we now know what it actually costs from these donors for the off-menu item of replacing a nominee in the middle of the summer, because that was certainly if you have to ask, you can't afford it price tag. And considering the amount of money that's come in, you can get the sense that that is exactly what was asked for them to really, really pull the trigger there. So that is your general sense of what is happening now. Areas of investment for the Republicans are Wisconsin and Ohio. Areas of investment for Democrats are Nevada and Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, it's all 7, but in some cases, the Republicans, I'm sure, have been putting all the money they can in Nevada and all the money they can in other states. And if they, they'll look at Wisconsin and say, we're behind, let's shift the resources. I'm making this up because I didn't look at a Senate map before we got here to say, we're going to move the money out of Nebraska and instead put it in this race over here. Yeah, so it's a reallocation, and as we talked, it's the 7 battleground areas, right? It's Georgia, it's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, and then I don't know. I mean, maybe the Democrats think they can win Florida, or maybe the Republicans think they can win someplace else. But that's where it's all going to go, because at the end of the day, it's about electoral college voting, and what really
that's how the game works.
That's the 7 counties that are undecided.
Now, let's remove ourselves from the current day. If I could go back to your time when you were behind the scenes, when you were having these conversations with
Bill
the
did black and white apparently with our clothing on. So.
There we go. We're gonna have one of the old time bands like no. So when you are behind the scenes and you're having these conversations, is there any moments that you can that stick out from your time in Congress where somebody thought they had money that was going to come to them, then all of a sudden they find themselves with the tide run out?
Yeah, so in my case, there was very little money because I was running against somebody who had been in for 32 years, and there'd been sort of sequentially a tough race against him every now and then. And I actually followed a woman whose husband ran the state chamber of commerce and got lots of money and resources. So what happened in my case is I had one great benefit. I worked in local television news, and so I started with very high name ID. So this is honest to God. On my first congressional race, now this is in the 90s, I raised $167,000 and spent $166,000. And I told my fundraiser and chief of staff, if we go in the hole, you're paying it, I'm not. So we stayed pretty close to budget. But again, a lot of what you spend money on in campaigns is name ID, right? And trying to identify who the client is. And for some reason, the ABC affiliate I worked with would not let me run for Congress and anchor the 10 o'clock news at the same time. But sort of the basis was over there. But again, it's a different time era when by the time I ran my 4th campaign, which would have been against the city of Madison's mayor, who was sort of this golden lefty child from the 60s. He got elected mayor of Madison, I think when he was 22 or 23, at the height of the Vietnam protests.
Okay.
And so now he wanted to run against me then. And in that race, we spent well over $1 million, $1.2 million or $1.2 million.
Wow.
We sort of snuck on him in the first case, but now the Senate races are 50, 60, 100, $200 million. So then it's really out of your local control. Right now you're dependent on the national infrastructure to get you there, and you'd like to think they're fond of you and they'd stick with you even if you suck in the polls, but they don't. So a good friend of mine, Jim Slattery, Democrat from Kansas. There was a sort of a wave when Clinton was there. Slattery was there, another congressman from Ohio. There was a third guy in there, a congressman from Tennessee. All decided to run for governor in 1994. And they all got wiped out because it was the Republican landslide in 94. But Jim came back and decided later on he wanted to run for the Senate. So high name ID, well thought of, moderate Democrat in Kansas. And we were actually election observers in Iraq together in 2010. And that's
Oh,
when
wow.
he was running for governor. And after I saw him in Baghdad, they cut him off. The numbers didn't come up high enough. You know, he'd been a loyal party loyalist, had won statewide elections. And so, you know, it's coming in on the fall right now, and they just said, sorry. And he said, well, I told you what was going to happen is the other candidate was going to get all this money early on and be able to fundraise, and then we'd start to get traction, and now we're going, and they said, very nice, keep in touch. How's it going? So it works that way both sides. Yeah, so that it's a very, you know, again, it's, you'd like, you know, politics is a relationship business, but not when it comes to winning or losing.
How bad do the feelings get hurt?
Oh, I think they get hurt pretty badly, especially if you feel like the rug got pulled out of you, and especially if you're somebody that's a challenger that suddenly starts to show momentum, and now it's going to get close. And by close, I mean it's 52-48. It's the kind of thing that could be a margin of error. Yeah, there's a lot of people who get their hearts broken. Most people I know who left for office on their own terms. When I quit, I was a term limit guy. Somebody sent me a note, which I still have. Nice job. Still leave the stage while they're still applauding, which I thought great metaphor for politics, and it's a great metaphor for life. You know, you got to know when to move on. But other friends of mine, you know, I'm about to go do some presentations for the U.S. State Department overseas, sort of talking about the elections, how the Electoral College works. I could probably stop in 4 or 5 United States and explain it along the way, because not only do people in Slovenia not understand it, most Americans still don't understand that Electoral College thing. But the guy I've done a couple of these with over the years was elected with me in the 90s, lost after 2 terms in the House. And I think since then, Larry's run for Congress again, for State Secretary of State, for Lieutenant Governor, he's sort of Harold Stassen, and I think for Senate again. And people want to get even and sort of go for it again. And, so a lot of those people, it still sticks in my guts. I saw a buddy of mine who I served with from Boston, who served 2 terms and lost. And I was in Boston for business a month ago, and you know, eating nachos and drinking a beer. And he's still pissed off that he lost in '94, and still grousing about the member of Congress who beat him, and still thinking about running again. And I'm going,
wow,
dude, it's 30 years ago. Let it go. Yeah, it's hard.
That's like some like high school girlfriend stuff,
or high school sports stuff.
Exactly. You know? Yeah, Al Bundy. You know, 5 touchdowns in 1 game.
Yeah, completely. People have a hard time getting over that. Well, look at the Wisconsin coach, Luke Frickel, who they hired from Cincinnati, who's having some struggles early on this season. But he was talking about early on in his interview about not liking to lose. And in the interview, he talked about a wrestling match he lost his sophomore year in high school, which has got to be 25 years ago now.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with politics. I mean, the hard part of it is they keep scoring. You either win or you lose. So, you know, philosophically, I was a term limit guy. I don't think it's meant to be a career, but I always tell people I left, you know, undefeated and unindicted, which was the best way to get out of politics.
All right. So let's say you're in a race where the polling's not disastrous, right? You're running maybe 8 points behind, but it's not where you want it. You know, you need it a little bit closer to be a slam dunk to get the investment. What are you doing to try to get the attention? Like what are the metrics that the central parties want to see that get you in the race, so you believe that you're going to get the spigot turned on going forward?
Well, I think the people closest to you have to pony up again. So you've got to go to major donors and raise money and say, look, I raised, you know, $250,000 for a television buy in the next 2 weeks. Then I think you can show that the people on the ground still believe you. But at the end of the day, it still has to do with polling, whether it's credible or not. So they won't only look at you, they're also going to look at what's going on around you, right? So if, you know, you're in trouble as a Republican congressman, but the Senate candidate's up by 7 points, it's like, well, what's wrong with you? I mean, we know what your district looked like. They also, I think, as you look now, you know, the field of play really in the House doesn't tend to be much more 40 seats on both sides, Republicans or Democrats, because we've made the seats so precise with redistricting, that there's not a lot of room. And so you'll see, for example, in the races this fall, you're likely to see far more seats that used to be Republican and became Democrat shift back to the Republicans, or vice versa. And then the only thing that really matters is to some degree is polling. You just have to show you're a credible candidate and there's a path forward. But I have to tell you, the number of cases where, like in my class when I got elected, there were 3 of us nobody ever thought we would win. A guy from Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, who ended up later running for the Senate in Pennsylvania and serving a couple terms, and a guy named Jim Nussel, who was from northeastern Iowa. And we all won in different ways. Santorum was very strong pro-life. They had a real grassroots organization. Nussel had been an attorney and had a lot of press coverage, so had some name stuff. And in my case, I was just, a TV guy. So I, used my TV teeth, and I used to have better flowing locks back then. In fact, we once shot a commercial at my house, and they had the lights really going. This was the time when you still use like lights and camera trucks and audio people and everything else in the world. And I am sweating, like I'm going to the chair. And John looks over at my wife and says, "Tess, do you have a hairdryer in your house?" And she looks at John and says, "John, I'm married to an anchor man. We have hairdryers." So it's a slog to get there. And so I think if we were talking about this the other day and about troubles with polling in 2020. In 2020. There were 8 races where the polling was off to such a degree that the Republicans walked away from races they should have put more money on the table.
Yeah.
And the Democrats kept pouring money into races, Beto O'Rourke, that they should have known just by the metrics not to stick to it. So polling really matters, but polling isn't everything. And so they're going to take into account what's the momentum. So stuff will start to break in the last 10 days. But you're right. It's at the end of the day, you can't win a campaign unless you have the resources. And for the political operatives, not your buddy the dentist down the road or your friend who's the vice president at the bank or credit union down the road, they're going to stick with you through thick and thin. Or people who believe really strongly because of ideological reasons, you're pro-life, you're pro-choice, whatever sort of side you're on those markers. They'll stick with you. But the men and the women in D.C. who make these decisions, it's like who's going to get the liver transplant and who doesn't. And sorry, you're 6th on the list. That ain't going to happen.
How big is that circle? There's obviously the person who's leading each of these committees, and I would assume that they probably have the final say. But is it a large coterie? Is it more of the conference where people are getting polled, or does it maybe just vary year by year depending on who the leader is?
Yeah, you'll have a group of folks who actually are members that are attached to it. So like Steve Daines, who's a friend of mine, is the NRSC chair this time out. Steve's from Montana. His chief of staff just left to go run the senatorial campaign for Steve. And so at the end of the day, it's his former chief of staff and the professionals around him to figure out. The committees will have their own polling firms they use, and they'll be tied into the polling that the president's using. Oftentimes you'll see one, like the Terrence Group did my polling. They did Tommy Thompson's polling. They did a lot of the polling in state races and U.S. Senate races in Wisconsin. So you sort of become experts in particular areas. But at the end of the day, it's maybe 8 or 10 professional staffers and a couple of members of the Senate or House who makes the decision. And obviously in the House, the Speaker plays a big role.
And I would assume that those people tend to be pretty popular around this time of year when those decisions are getting made, right?
Well, they're not, and so, so if I'm in Wisconsin and they cut off the funding for me, my first call is going to be Ron Johnson, who's another Republican senator from Wisconsin, to say, tell these guys in Washington I can win this race.
Yeah.
But I'm serious. It tends to be very clinical. It's numbers. The numbers are there. The numbers aren't there. And again, if you start to get stories like that, what happens. Now your local fundraising dries up, and so people just. When I left office, this is when I left after winning 4 times. People said when you leave, you'll meet 3 groups of people. Somebody who you thought would do stuff for your next career who will never return your calls. People who helped you in your career who will stick with you because you're a friend and they really were in it because of your friendship and the work you did. Or a third group who you really didn't know, who started to step out of the shadows and said, you did a great job. Let me know anything you did. And people still notice. I mean, in doing the podcast, Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans, I'm much more active on social media than I was before I got involved in the podcast world. And I get notes from people that said, you helped my son get into West Point. You helped my daughter when she lost her passport overseas. It's people remember those little touches. You were busy going in between votes, but you stopped in the hallway and took a picture with my daughter. And that's a lot of what it is on the campaign trail. So, for example, in Wisconsin, if you look this time out, Justin, the odds are there are very few races where there's going to be ticket splitting. If you look in the U.S. Senate right now, there's only one senator from Maine, Susan Collins, who got elected in Maine at the same time Joe Biden was getting elected in Maine. Now, last time out, that happened in a lot of off-year Senate and governor races. Georgia, prime example, Brian Kemp gets reelected, Raphael Warnock gets elected. But that's not going to happen here. But one thing that can happen, if you look at Tammy's numbers, for instance, Tammy Baldwin, she does very good constituent work. And a lot of those sort of person-to-person stories and staying connected back home really matters. But if Trump wins the state, can she outpoll Kamala by 1 point, by 2 points, at 3 points? It gets to be pretty hard after that. So it will be interesting, especially in the battleground states where Democrats are defending longstanding incumbents, whether they can make it work.
This is your update brought to you by TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Yes, friends, head on over there right now and grab the ability to get 2 bonus episodes each and every week for only the price of a cup of coffee per week. You can get 2 bonus episodes delivered to you. And in the most recent one that went out for folks on Thursday, they got the exclusive rundown of all the new polls that are coming out. Does the New York Times really believe that Pennsylvania is 4 points more liberal than the country? Break all that down. Teamsters, Fed rate cut. Head on over there. TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Let's get into the stories that we didn't have a chance to get to. And this one is a diggity doozy. CNN has revealed controversial comments made by North Carolina gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson on a pornographic website a decade ago. Robinson, it is important, denies these claims, but he allegedly posted under the username Minnie Solder between 2008 and 2012, expressing offensive views, including support for slavery and derogatory remarks against Black, Jewish, and Muslim people. The comments contradict many of his current political stances, as Robinson reportedly discussed enjoying transgender pornography. He has been a critic of the trans community. CNN matched the username to Robinson using his shared biographical details and common email addresses. Robinson has dismissed the allegations as, quote, tabloid trash and continues to focus on his gubernatorial campaign, denying responsibility for the comments and maintaining his controversial public positions. The rumors on Thursday morning when this all began to stir was that the Trump campaign showed internal polls of Trump up 3 in North Carolina, but Robinson down 13. That is consistent with public polling, which has shown him trailing Trump. He has not been popular in his race against Democratic rival Josh Stein. Further, there was conversation that the Trump campaign was pushing on Robinson to essentially just drop out, that they didn't feel like he had a chance to win anyway, so just don't be on the ballot. And that'll be that. So, when we say controversial comments on the website Nude Africa between 2008 and 2012, what are we referring to? Well, in one comment, Minnie Solder, allegedly Robinson said he was, quote, a black Nazi. And even before Kanye. Interesting. On the same one, Robinson wrote in another post that he supported the return of slavery. Quote, "Slavery is not bad. Some people need to be slaves. I wish they would bring slavery back. I would certainly buy a few." In March 12th, Robinson wrote that he preferred the former leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, over the leadership in Washington during the administration of Barack Obama. Quote, "I'd take Hitler over any of the S that's in Washington right now." In a series of 7 posts in October 2011, Robinson disparaged Martin Luther King in particularly intense terms, calling him a, quote, "commie bastard," quote, "worse than a maggot," quote, "ho effing phony," and a, quote unquote, "huckster." In October 2010, Robinson used, allegedly, the anti-Semitic slur "Heeb" when discussing how he liked the show Good Times, developed by Norman Lear, saying that, quote, "the show was a bunch of Heeb-written liberal BS." While discussing the Taliban, he referred to Muslims as, quote, "little rag-headed bastards," and said, quote, "if Muslims took over, liberals would be the first ones to be beheaded." And Robinson used the homophobic F slur frequently. In a largely positive forum discussing a photo of 2 men kissing after returning from military deployment, Robinson wrote the sole negative comment, "That's some old sick A F slur BS." Now here's the problem. Sometimes in a scandal, you have an image that is shattered by evidence that you are doing something secretly in your past. A straight-laced politician is revealed to have had an extramarital affair, a child that he did not acknowledge, a gay liaison. The problem with Mark Robinson in this case is that everything that's written in this sounds exactly like Mark Robinson. Mark Robinson is known as being an unfiltered, just say it as it is kind of guy. He has had a bunch of quotables already in this race that he embraces, including waving his hand over his genitals and saying that the biggest problem with abortion these days is women have to get this under control. And so the idea that before he was in politics, he would be just a totally out of control poster on a pornographic website, which is, I would assume, a speech maximalist environment, let's say in our academic terms, is not surprising at all. According to Politico, in a follow-up story on this, which was K-File of CNN that broke this initial story, but Politico then has another story saying that the email that was involved in this also was apparently found in the Ashley Madison leaks. And so, if we're going to understand that Mark Robinson is radioactive, what does it mean? Personally, I don't believe in reverse coattails. Reverse coattails are that something down the ballot could hurt the top of the ballot. So if Mark Robinson is dead, right? If, let's say, he's just going to get blown out by 15, does that hurt Trump in North Carolina? I don't believe so. I believe that people make their decision from the top down, and it does not affect the top of the ticket unless, for whatever reason, Mark Robinson becomes a central part of the final weeks of this campaign, which the Democrats would love, right? So you never know. But if all of a sudden Donald Trump is like, no, Mark Robinson's honor needs to be defended, and he's up on stage not only in North Carolina but also other places, then yeah, it will affect Donald Trump, not only in North Carolina but also nationally. I don't think it's going to happen. The reporting is that even at the upcoming event for Trump in North Carolina, Mark Robinson's not going to be on stage. But there we go. Hoo boy. ballots for North Carolina go out next week. A national pro-Palestinian group, the Uncommitted National Movement, announced that it will not endorse Vice President Kamala Harris during her campaign stop in Michigan, citing frustration with her stance on the United States support for Israel during the Israeli-Hamas war. The group, which previously organized protests against President Biden's handling of the conflict, also opposes Donald Trump, accusing him of planning to escalate violence in Gaza while urging voters to oppose Trump. They remain split on supporting Harris, with some opting to skip voting for her. The group's decision reflects ongoing tensions between centrist Democrats and progressive anti-war advocates. We covered with Jen Briney a couple weeks ago about the way that the uncommitted delegates were handled at the DNC. It was a discordant note in an otherwise very jubilant crowd. But we will see. While Democratic enthusiasm is particularly high, it's been odd to me watching the polling that's come in, and we talked about this on the exclusive episode, that Michigan's actually polled more liberal than Wisconsin, which is odd, because Wisconsin in general is a more liberal state than Michigan. And the fraught element of Michigan for Kamala Harris is that she's got the Dearborn problem. She's got the Muslim problem. So it'll be very interesting to square that circle of all the percentages that we're going to wind up digging through after this election. Latino vote, black vote, youth vote. Those are going to be very interesting to watch. But also the Muslim vote, specifically in Michigan, and specifically if Kamala Harris doesn't win. Finally, House Republicans are shifting toward a 3-month stopgap spending bill to prevent a government shutdown next week, abandoning plans for stricter voter eligibility rules. Bipartisan talks are ongoing with a plan to extend 2024 funding into December. House Speaker Mike Johnson is expected to post the bill's text soon, aiming for a vote early next week. The strategy change follows a failure of a 6-month funding bill that included voter reforms backed by President Donald Trump. Hardline conservatives will oppose this new plan, and it will very notably rely on Democratic votes to pass, get into the Senate, and then be voted on by the Senate. In that chamber, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer expressed confidence in avoiding the shutdown with bipartisan support. And that is your update. TakePoliticsSeriously.com is where you need to go to support this show for only a cup of coffee per week. You get 2 bonus episodes each and every week. And now, back to Mr. Scott Klug, former congressman. Well, that's what, you're looking at right now. Some of the state polling for which the Senate candidates, especially the ones that were running against incumbents like Bernie Moreno in Ohio and Bob Casey and McCormick in Pennsylvania, that now you're starting to see that gap tighten. Over the summer and the spring, Trump was running like 9-10 points ahead of those. And I think now that the name ID has kind of caught up a little bit with all the ads that have pumped through over the last several months, that you're starting to see at least those numbers close, which is what Republicans want to see, because those initial numbers were yikes. Yeah.
Well, but the Democrats' numbers are really dragged down early because of Biden, right? So there were a lot of folks wildly outperforming the White House. Yeah, but it's, the polling thing, we've talked about this. Nobody's really figured out what the British call the quiet Tory. I mean, it's a conservative voter who won't talk to pollsters because they think they're part of the media. And the British media's the pollsters have gotten this, they were wrong on Scottish independence. They were wrong on, Brexit. They were wrong on the previous race when Boris Johnson and the Conservatives upped their margins.
Well, they were even wrong here on Labor, right? Labor was supposed to have this historic blowout, and they certainly won. They took control, but not nearly by the margins. I mean, there were thoughts that the Tory party was going to, be broken based on at least some of the numbers that were coming out early.
Right. So the Liberal Democrats, this is another British party, and the Reform Party both got big chunks nobody saw coming. And so I look today at Wisconsin, for example, and if you look at where Hillary was in 16 and where Biden was in 20, they're way ahead of where Kamala is today. So she's ahead, by 3 or 4 points, but Hillary was ahead by 7 or 8. And so you wonder whether, and this is the great challenge for pollsters, this is happening, and conservatives aren't answering, polling questions, whether it's text or phone calls or cell lines or wherever it is today. And so that sort of hangs in my mind, wondering whether we're going to see that again. Because Biden was supposed to win Wisconsin by 40 or 50,000 votes, and he barely won it by 10,000. So it will be a late night.
Before it was unceremoniously ended early, I was a listener to the Kellyanne Conway and David Plouffe podcast, The Campaign Managers, where one of the things that would routinely set Kellyanne Conway off were the polling in Wisconsin, and specifically the predilection for some pollsters to show Democrats up by like 8-9 points when this has not been a 8-9 point state in a very long time.
No, not at the least. It's a state with a long history of ticket splitting. My mom was a Democrat, my dad was a Republican, but they'd go in this direction occasionally for candidates they'd like. We've got 2 strong metropolitan Democratic areas in Madison and Milwaukee, and the rest of the state's red. In fact, I think the district that sort of goes from the center of Wisconsin up to Lake Superior and very cold Minnesota, I think is the 2nd or 3rd most Trump district in the state. And we've got, a very liberal Democratic Senator, Tammy, is up for re-election, and Ron Johnson, who won by the skin of his teeth last time out. So we're a hard state to predict, and have been a hard state to predict for 40 years.
There was a moment a few weeks ago, to go back to the triage question, where a friend of mine, we were both puzzled over Kari Lake in Arizona releasing an internal poll that had her down like 3 points, which is not great considering Donald Trump, at least at that point that she released it, had consistently run ahead of not only Joe Biden by a lot, but Kamala Harris by a little in that state. So for her to show herself down 3 points was something that was puzzling. And then my friend was like, well, I wonder if that's a triage thing where she's like, hey, look, I think they believe I'm down by 5 or 6. I want to show them that I'm actually only down 3. I'm still in striking distance. Is that the kind of stuff that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we've had a long list of pretty bizarre candidates over the last 30 years. A good friend of mine, Mike Castle, was a governor of Delaware and ran for the Senate. And you remember this, he lost to a woman named, oh my God, what was her name? Carolyn O'Donnell or whatever, who had to hold a press conference to say she wasn't a witch.
She wasn't a witch. No, that was no. She did the ad that said "I'm not a witch," where she was looking in dead eye into the camera, looking like a witch.
Yeah. So Kari Lake's not high on my list of Republican senatorial candidates, and I think she's one of those people who could be at the edge. Are they better off putting all the money into the presidential campaign and leaving her behind, because she may be a drag on the ticket in a very close race? Although her Democratic opponent is not exactly a crackerjack either, so I'm not sure who's going to win that Senate race.
I think that they've run, and I think we were talking about this on your podcast. It's going to come out in a couple of weeks, but Ruben Gallego's a hothead. I can't believe that they haven't really pressed him enough. He's got like a really messy scandal with his ex-wife and a lobbyist, and like there's a lot of stuff there that I thought was going to come more to the fore. But Kari Lake, I think, has tried her best now over the last year to kind of repair the image of the totally out there bomb thrower who will say everything. Where if you start out your campaign trying to apologize to Meghan McCain and having her spurn you on Twitter, then it's like, all right, I think you're trying to hit reverse on a car that has gone too far down the road. But still, I don't know. I mean, I guess from the Republican point of view, look, if she's going to win, it's going to be because of Trump, because she's so closely tied to him. So why spend the money? Either it's going to happen or it's not naturally.
Yeah, and I think everybody talks about this today. I think the surge to Hispanics is pretty real. It's especially apparently pronounced in Las Vegas and in Nevada.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting trend that's going to offset it. Meanwhile, back to Wisconsin, the key for Republicans in Wisconsin was a circle of suburbs around Milwaukee. These called the WOW counties: Washington, Ozaukee, and Waukesha. People who are listening to this have no idea what I'm talking about anyway. I should just make the names up. It's Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee counties. But those are very purple suburbs, like the Atlanta suburbs, which are going to decide this race. I mean, it's It's the suburbs and Roswell and places like that just to the east of Atlanta will make the difference. If the Republicans start to lose those, Trump will be in trouble. And I think it's going to be the same time out in sort of suburban Milwaukee. It's going to be a challenge. But, it's a crazy, sort of swirl out there where, Republicans pick up this and Democrats get that. And those people in the Democratic Party don't like that. So now they come over here, we're talking about young black male voters. I think is a real interesting question, and whether that's a surge or not a surge. So,
before we move off of Kari Lake, I'm sure that there's going to be some repudiation by you for going against another television personality candidate. I thought you guys would stick together.
No, I always remember one time on a flight back to Washington, D.C. when I worked in television in Washington, and I'm sitting across from my photographer and the sound guy, and there's a woman sitting next to me who's going to see her boyfriend in Washington, and she looks in her purse and goes, "Oh my God, I forgot my makeup." And I reached into my suit pocket.
Don't worry, I got you.
Yeah, and the guys across from me are laughing hysterically, and she's looking at me like, "Why do you have makeup?" And I said, "Sorry, I work in television."
TV.
So, yeah, completely television. Yeah, I think there's enough room in the party that we can both sort of carve stuff out, because I think the Democratic Party, like the Republicans, if we were in Europe or some other place where we had a parliamentary system, both of our parties would completely shatter, right? You'd have a progressive wing. Might be some party. You'd have the sort of Southern blue dogs who'd be more conservative on social issues. You'd have the libertarians like me, the real conservative socials. You'd have the suburbanites. And so that's the crazy coalition, and pieces of that coalition break off, and parts of the country scramble. I mean, George Senior Bush got elected in Maine in a district where he'd lose by 8 points today, and Bill Clinton would lose Hope, Arkansas by 17 points. So it's just that's just the way it goes. So and we talked to a couple folks about battlegrounds, and as Larry Sabato said from the Sabato report, great
crystal ball.
Crystal ball and a political scientist at the University of Virginia. He says, it's always a battleground till it isn't. And so it'll be interesting to see this time where things really change. Ohio, I can remember during the Clinton-Gore campaign, it was like, oh my God, who's going to win Ohio?
So goes Ohio.
Yeah, and the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, won his last race with 66% of the vote. Gavin Newsom only got 59% of the vote in Democratic California. So think about that. Ohio's more Republican than California's Democratic today. And it's sort of the same thing with Florida. I mean, the Republicans have had a gigantic surge of registration in South Florida.
Well, that's, and that's where I was raised. So that's the only state politics that I ever really feel like I have any kind of handle on is Floridian politics. And anytime, and this is the time of year where Democrats try to talk themselves into the idea that Florida's in play, and there's an abortion thing on the ballot, and it's weed on the ballot, and you should be able to do X, Y, and Z. Here's the problem. Jeb Bush, Rick Scott, Ron DeSantis, different candidates. They all did the exact same thing. They built the state party for the Republicans over 2 decades. And DeSantis has supercharged it. And meanwhile, it's been a on and off plaything for the Democrats where once every 4 years they dump money into it, but they don't build their bench. They don't foster their strongholds. And I'm from Broward County. Broward County was the only county in South Florida that still voted for the Democrat in that Ron DeSantis election. It is about as blue as it gets. Miami's gotten redder. Palm Beach has gotten redder. Broward, still that stronghold of old exiles from New York City. And they don't foster. I mean, like Debbie Wasserman Schultz has sat in that seat for what? She hasn't done anything for the state of Florida. She's played nationally with the Clintons, and then was part of the most embarrassing scandal for that party in decades in 2016 when the Russians hacked their emails.
Yeah, well, look at the hanging Chad thing. I mean, that's still remarkable. Sort of watch that. Yeah, and it's interesting because it has sort of been ground zero, that part of Florida, for election issues for, my God, I think they finally replaced the Broward County clerk, didn't they? The governor fired her and then put somebody else in charge. But the thing I admire Florida for, which a lot of states don't do, including Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where it's going to be a problem and a source of conspiracy theories, is you're actually set up so you can count absentee ballots,
Yes.
when they come to the door, I think, yeah. And Wisconsin doesn't do it, and Pennsylvania doesn't do it, and it's going to be the same shots of semi-fulls of
Yeah.
ballots showing up in Milwaukee at 11:30 at night, and everybody goes, "Oh, they're wiring the race." And in fact, there was legislation this year to allow counting of counting of ballots the day they arrived. Or what California does is they don't count them, but they open them and certify them. Then it's just running them through the machines. It's ridiculous we couldn't get it passed, and the state should be embarrassed about it. And the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, Florida. I think this is something that I think I said in the podcast that Ron DeSantis should have almost run on in the primary as a way of dealing with election security. Is saying, hey, look, here's the Florida blueprint. The Florida blueprint is you only have X amount of time to send in an absentee ballot. We count them when they get there. We don't reveal the results until the night of, but that's why immediately you got 25% of the electorate in, and everything else we count as fast as possible. We've got results for you within 3 or 4 hours of the polls closing, maybe sooner if it's not a close race. I want to take that national. Here's my framework for what I want to do nationally, and we're going to restore faith in our elections, because that's the way you actually do it. Like everything else with poll watchers and stopping, money from PACs and everything, that's all end around stuff. And it tends to just, I think, even lead into the conspiracy when a lot of this isn't hard. Count the absentee ballot. You can only send an absentee ballot up to 72 hours before the election. At that point, you got to go in and do it yourself. It's easy.
So here's the coolest election reform in the country. And there's only one state does it, and it's Nebraska. So if you live in Nebraska, you can get a subpoena to be a poll worker the same way you get a subpoena to serve on a jury.
Okay.
And the requirement is you have to serve on 4 elections. And they can be a county spring election, it could be a school board election, it doesn't matter. And people try to get out of it, just like everybody tries to get out of jury duty.
Yeah.
But you can't. And if you don't show up, they literally arrest you and take you to jail.
Wow.
So this year, for example, in Douglas County, which is where Omaha is, 45% of the jury workers on election night will be people who were subpoenaed to work. Now, it does 2 things. First, it teaches you about how well the system works. If you're in the room, you know how it goes on. It's sort of like if you do jury duty, you develop a different sense for the justice system. And if you want to have a conspiracy, try to make that work when 45% of the people in the room don't even want to be there. They're only there so they don't get arrested and get fined. And I think in a lot of places where people are still all hinked up about the election system, I think it's a great reform idea. And people grouse about it and everything else in the world. But when they do it, if you talk to the folks in Nebraska, Republicans or Democrats, they respect it because they know it works. And when people get challenged, they go, "What? It doesn't work that way. I was in a jury center in that Lutheran church last election." So that's one of my favorite ideas to make the country more sane when it comes to election security.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'm personally of the belief that the longer elections are like company or fish, like they go really bad after 3 days. Like you really, you got to wrap this up. It's got to be short and sweet. Like I understand maybe having it bleed into the day after if it's extraordinarily close and you want to make sure that you've shaken loose everybody's pants pockets to see if in case there's one ballot left or something like that. But when we go a week, 2 weeks of these totally indiscriminate drops, that just to me feels like breeding ground for people to get all agitated about it.
Yeah, and it should be. And again, if you look at some of the stuff, one of the big reforms after Bush Gore was to put cameras in counting centers so people would know it was great. But there's no play-by-play, right? It's not like, Scott's handing this box to Justin because that just came in from the 3rd Ward. So they just see people opening boxes and moving boxes over there, and some go in the back, and this stuff.
And it caused more heartache in Georgia, where you had the whole Ruby Freeman thing, where there was a box that came from under a table, and everybody thought, oh, it's like a magician's trick.
Yeah, so that's another thing. So you have to be careful with some of these reforms because sometimes they make the problem worse because people just aren't paying attention. But again, I think if you capture them, make them work a poll. People told me, I thought you were a Republican and you were for freedom. You shouldn't be mandating people to do jury watching. And it's like, well, the hell with you. I mean, they mandate people to do lots of things, including serving in a jury, which is a hell of a lot more sensitive. You got to decide somebody's going to get the death penalty than whether you lose a Tuesday afternoon counting ballots somewhere in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Exactly. All right, Scott, I want to do one thing. I haven't prepped you on this, so hopefully you're okay with it before you go out. But this is rarely have we had somebody that is as open and fun that is served. I want to ask you this. Do you know what your number one search result on C-SPAN is? What clip of you on C-SPAN is the first result?
Wow. Well, it's probably something weird. You wouldn't have asked this question. I don't remember. I remember when Republicans took control in '94, and Newt said it was going to be a family-friendly environment, and I think I said, yeah, it was the Addams family, which didn't go speaker because we worked like 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. Everybody was sick. Everybody was so burned out. So that's the only one that possibly comes to mind. But you're going to tell me, and I'm sure I'll be wildly embarrassed.
No, I don't know if you'll be embarrassed because I haven't seen it. I just pulled it up while we were talking. March 10th, 1995. It is Republican Congressman Scott Klug of Wisconsin giving the Republican response to Bill Clinton's weekly radio address, talking about legal reforms to reduce frivolous lawsuits.
That's interesting. Wow. You know what? That wasn't even. They always pick somebody to do these because wasn't like the State of the Union. These were radio addresses Clinton would do over the weekend. So this was the rebuttal. And I can't tell you what it was in it because the honest to God's truth is I read whatever they handed to me. I was not on the Judiciary Committee. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on that. I could certainly spin stories about why I don't like, trial juries and, lots of lawyers making money off of people's misery. But no, I don't remember. I'm sure I did it. I don't remember a single word I said.
Well, you did do it, and by the way, you weren't kidding about your hair. You look like Troy McClure from The Simpsons. This is a perfect little coif here. Holy moly!
I prefer Troy Donahue from an earlier time.
But yeah, so doing the weekly rebuttal to Clinton's radio address was kind of like poll watching in Nebraska. You just got the short straw.
You got drafted to do it, and I think there's a little studio in the Capitol where Republicans have one room and the Democrats have other, and you could go in and cut stuff for your local radio station. So yeah, that was servitude. I didn't volunteer for that, nor did I. Falling asleep at night worrying about tort reform. So that's the honest to God's truth.
I wonder, do they even still do radio addresses, presidential radio addresses?
I'm sure it's social media. It's not radio addresses.
Yeah. Why not have a podcast? Just have a presidential podcast that comes out every Sunday. That'd be the way to go.
Or they just post 45 seconds on Facebook or YouTube of whatever the president's doing that day. I don't. That sounds to me like the sort of thing that they used to do on Sunday morning, where you had.
I believe so. Yeah.
Radio stations had to do their public service time, so they'd have somebody on from the Salvation Army talking about the food drive for half an hour, and they could sort of put it in a file. I think that sort of belongs in the same vein where they had to do it just to do it.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us on the show. You, of course, have your own podcast that I'm going to be on in the next few weeks, so let everybody know where they can get it.
Yeah, so the places you always find podcasts, including Justin, called Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans, because I think a big chunk of the country still can't figure out how the hell we got here and how we get out of it. And it came from people, the first conversation started with some guy who grabbed me in the cereal aisle of a grocery store as I reached up to grab a bag of granola. Yes, Republicans do eat granola. And he said, Klug, what's going on? The Republicans are running around the country trying to ban middle school books, and the Democrats are trying to take the stove out of my kitchen. Who the flock voted for these people? So
yeah,
that was my first orphan, and I've met many more since then.
Well, I'll tell you what, it is a great show. I'm going to be on there. Heaton's going to be on there, so everybody should go check it out. Scott, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us and share some of your wisdom from being inside the machine.
All right. Thanks, Justin. Talk to you later.
And that'll wrap it up for us today. Politics, 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 written and hosted by me, Justin Robert Young, for Dog and Pony Show Audio in Austin, Texas. A big shout out and thank you to Scott Klug for coming on the show. We love to pick his brain on the program. If you'd like to email me, it is theyoungamerican@gmail.com. Find, follow, and share clips of the show, as well as exclusive content on TikTok, Justin R. Young, Instagram, Justin R. Young, and Twitter, Justin R. Young. On YouTube, we've got our full episodes. Politics is where you find that. YouTube.com/@politics. And you can find our audio version of the show, letter P, letter X, number 3, podcast.com. px3podcast.com. You can support us with a one-time donation. PayPal is paypal.me/payjury. Venmo is Justin-Young-20. Cash App is PX3Cash. You can send me anything you'd like in the mail. Post Office Box 153184, Austin, Texas 78715. Again, that is P.O. Box 153184, Austin, Texas 78715. You can always get our bonus content at TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Our $3 tier gets you 2 bonus podcasts per week covering all the news we miss on our free podcasting schedule, and our $10 tier gets you that, plus your name read at the end of the show like these fine folks in the Titanic. $10 tier. Edwin, and vote Gloria Young for King of the New World Order. Mike, Edison, a dog named Checkers. Jeremy, Sarah Jeannie, Matthew, Phil, Dr. G is Nerdiness Charles, Neil, Darren, Idris Arslanian, Berkeley, Steven, Chad, Zombie Doc, Matt P, Chill, Adam, Sean Barnes. I went to high school with Sean Barnes. Big shout out to Sean Barnes for supporting this show. Song notes by how are you, bud? How are you? Song notes by David Potts, Nicholas, Sparky from Stevens, Florida, Fat Tony's PJs from New York, Michael, Devon, the CFP, the Borge B, Will, Gloria, my mom, Gray Zone, Peepaw, Robert, J. Van Ord, Marcus with a Q, DP4 Bongo, Sam, John, Niemeister, Chief Andy, Robert, Casey, Paul, Adam, Dr. Whiskey, Dustin, D. Laser, Nick, Joe, Middle-Aged Mike, Utah Jimmy Montana, the Jan, Alo, D. Really, Craig, and Andrew. You want your name read on the show? One place to do it. TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Next week on the show, we've got some great guests for you. Of YouTube fame, Mr. Beat will be joining us. And Jeff Maurer makes his return to the show to talk about how comedy has intertwined its way into the very communication of the campaigns. Self-aware Donald Trump dances, drill tweets in official PR releases. What is comedy in this election? We bring former Last Week Tonight writer Jeff Maurer back to the show. He also has a great Substack. But that'll be it for us today. Till next time, this is your old pal Justin Robert Young saying some shows talk about politics, others talk about politics, and still more discuss politics. But this is the only show that dares discuss all 3.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.